So it's time for another festival edition video. Passover is approaching, which means not only is Passover approaching, but it's also immediately followed by the festival of Unleavened Bread. And I feel like that's a festival that just doesn't get a whole lot of love. Everybody focuses on Pesach for obvious reasons. And Unleavened Bread just kind of becomes this tag-on festival, talking about, how we kind of like remember Passover for the next week. And so I thought maybe I would do some research and some study this year to offer some thoughts on the festival of Unleavened Bread. And you know where I went. I went where I always do, to Rabbi David Fohrman at Aleph Beta, to see what kind of studies he might have on the idea of unleavened bread, and I was not disappointed. So I'll link the original videos that I was learning from, and it's something he touches on in a book that he wrote called Exodus, a Parashah Companion. I'll link both of those things in the description of this video so that you can check those out and go more in depth from the original source if you'd like to. But so for 7 days following Pesach, following Passover, we don't eat any leaven. No leaven in our house. We don't eat any leaven. The only bread that we are allowed to have during that time is matzah, that unleavened matzah bread that you have at Passover and at Seder. And of course, the passage comes out of Exodus that talks about when the Israelites left Egypt in the story of the Passover. They didn't have time to let their bread rise. And so when I'm often teaching about this in the middle of the Seder meal, I'll talk about how this unleavened bread is a reminder of how quickly God's deliverance comes, that God's deliverance comes so fast, so quickly when he decides to rescue us that we can't even let our bread rise. And I do love that teaching point. And yet Fohrman, in brilliant fashion that only Fohrman could do, he points out that in fact, this story that talks about this is tied to another story, and not just in a maybe these stories are tied together fashion, but in a pretty undeniable way, these stories are tied together. So Fohrman talks about these 6 words that parallel these 2 stories together. The story in Exodus, where it speaks of the Israelites, leaving, and the Egyptians giving them all of their wealth on their way out of Egypt, and they didn't have time to let their bread rise. There is maybe the word that catches our attention the most, like the most odd word in the story, is a word in the Hebrew that is lahit mamea. Lahit mamea. And this is a very interesting word. It actually shows up twice. This is the second time that the word shows up. And so Rabbi Fohrman says, he suggests, I think when you read this story, when you hear this, I think when you see that word, it kind of grabs your attention. And maybe if you're really good with your text, you realize that you've seen this word once before. And when you go back to the time that you saw that word before, you start to realize that there is in fact all kinds of other parallels between this story and the other story. So the story we're looking at is the story in Exodus. It's in Parashat Bo, where, like we said, the Egyptians are giving them their stuff, and the Israelites leave Egypt so quickly they can't let their bread rise. And Lahit Mamea also shows up in the book of Genesis. It shows up when Yehuda is talking to Jacob about how they need to go back down to Egypt. They need to go buy, they've already been down to Egypt once. They've already bought grain. They're now out of food. They're now out of grain, and they need to go buy that food and that grain again. But they've been told by Joseph, they don't know it's Joseph at this point, but they've been told that they will not be able to buy any grain unless they bring Benjamin. But Jacob doesn't want to let them bring Benjamin. And so Yehuda is essentially begging his father, who's already turned down Reuben once. He's saying, you just got to let us. And one of the things he says is, if if we wouldn't have sat here wasting all of this time, we could have been back and forth to Egypt twice already. And that phrase contains that same word that we saw in Exodus, lahit mamea. And so then Fohrman begins to look at these stories, and he shows that prior to this word usage, there have been 4 other unique word usages that show up in these 2 stories. And they don't just show up in these 2 stories, but these same word usages. One of them is orev, which is the same root as erev in the Exodus story. So orev shows up in Genesis. Erev shows up in Exodus. There are 2 shawls that are used at the very beginning of these stories. Shawl, like a repetitive use of the word shawl. And so he just shows there's these 5 parallels between these stories that show up in perfect order. This can't be a mere coincidence. This has to be done on purpose by the authors tying these stories together. And then Fohrman suggests that actually the key to this is actually in the 6th parallel, which follows the lahit mamea usage at the end of this story, and it's 2 shavs. So it starts with 2 shawls, and it ends with 2 shavs, these 2 expressions of shav repeated against each other. And if you want to see all of this, if you're getting lost in the details, I know I would. You need to watch the original video, and I'll link that in the description. But the big idea and the big picture of this is that when Yehuda originally says these things, he says we could have been back and forth to Egypt twice over already. In the time that we've spent wasting, dilly-dallying is the word that Fohrman uses. In the time we've spent dilly-dallying here, arguing about whether or not you want to let us take Benjamin or not, we could have been back and forth to Egypt twice already. And Fohrman points out there's kind of this dark irony when Yehuda utters that phrase in that passage, because they're not going to make it back and forth to Egypt twice. They're going to make it down to Egypt and back, and then they're going to make it down to Egypt, but they're not going to come back nearly as quickly. They are going to end up slowly becoming captives over the years in Egypt, so that they are slaves in Egypt 430 years. They won't make it back and forth to Egypt twice already. Yehuda doesn't realize the future that lies in front of them and the struggle that they're going to have. And Fohrman goes on to talk about, really in that story, it's Yehuda's, shining moment is what Fohrman says. It's this moment where Yehuda is finally kind of overcoming his own dark history and his own mistakes to take responsibility for one of his brothers. Joseph's brother, the daughter of Rachel, Judah's finally doing what he failed to do in the story of Joseph. It was Yehuda's idea to get rid of Joseph and sell him to the Egyptians. And now he's, in a sense, kind of making up for that by taking responsibility for one of those brothers from that same side of the family that he used to hate, but now he's stepping up and taking responsibility. And yet Fohrman points out, but he still, at this point in the story, hasn't taken responsibility for the one brother that he's ultimately betrayed, which is Joseph. And so Fohrman draws all these parallels and makes some striking, I just love some of the points he's making. But I'll end kind of this video reflection with this closing point that I can't tell if Fohrman is driving at or not, but it's where my own mind goes. As we celebrate unleavened bread, as we eat the matzah, we're not just thinking about the speed and the haste out of which, that we came out of Egypt with. We're also thinking about the implications of not being honest about our own mistakes, not being humble, not being our brother's keeper, not, whatever those things might be. There are consequences to these decisions that we make that we can never see. We can never peer into the future and see how far those consequences are going to come. So maybe as we celebrate the festival of unleavened bread, it's also an invitation to take inventory about some of the redemptive movements that we might need to be about in our life, the things that we might need to come clean on, the relationships we might need to restore. Because it's 430 years later when God has to kind of show up and say, okay, let's go back to this moment. Let's kind of replay and redeem and call ourselves back to what seemed like probably in the moment not that big of a deal. Maybe not the thing that was going to define our future. And yet here I am rescuing an entire nation out of Egypt in the story of the Passover. We're eating unleavened bread, all in memory of a story that started with a brother exploiting another brother. And even as he processed his own redemption and owned up to some of his past mistakes in beautiful ways, there were still consequences to some of the things that he had did before that. So anyway, I don't know how any of those thoughts might hit you or what you might even take away from this own video. I would recommend actually watching Fohrman's video or reading his book. You'll probably get far more beautiful reflections out of that study than maybe this own video. But I thought I would think about unleavened bread this year. We always think about Pesach. We always think about Passover. But what is it that's going to be driving my reflections this year as I think about unleavened bread? Because I've never been satisfied with just, you eat the unleavened bread and you're like, oh, God's rescue, it comes quickly. We left Egypt so quickly. We couldn't even let our bread rise. I always feel like that's kind of low-hanging fruit. And maybe there's even more. And maybe I can put those two ideas together. Maybe I can say, maybe we can reflect on the fact that our actions have consequences, that there may be an inventory we need to take part in, and yet God's salvation, God's redemption, God's rescue can also rescue us from those consequences and rescue us from those moments so quickly. Maybe that's the beauty of this relationship, this partnership that we share together between God and us. Maybe there's this beauty of our side of the partnership and taking responsibility for who we are and our relationships and our actions. And a God who says, well, tomorrow I'm going to write a new chapter anyway. Anyway, there'll be many things for me to think about and journal about over the course of Unleavened Bread this year. But there's a thought for you for the Festival Edition playlist. We'll see you next year. Maybe we'll go back to Pesach next year and look at what we might have to learn from there.